So now I would like to officially welcome your speakers for tonight, beginning with our first speaker, Professor Emma Baker. Emma leads the University of Adelaide Centre for Housing, Urban and Regional Research. She's also Deputy Director of the National Health and Medical Research Council's newly established Centre for Research Excellence in Healthy Housing, and she coordinates the European Network for Housing Research Working Group on the residential context of health. Following her, our second speaker will be Peter Cazilos, the Program Director of the Master of Property at the University of Adelaide. Peter brings more than 20 years of experience in the field and teaches a number of property courses, including Development and Construction, Development Studio and the Property Dissertation course. His research focuses on a number of areas, including gentrification, residential property markets and property development. And then the third speaker who will come up and deliver a short response is Dr. Michael Fotheringham, who is the Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. He's a research and policy development specialist with experience in a wide range of areas, including housing and homelessness, public health, urban and community services planning. And he leads the strategic direction of the Institute, as well as the development of a contemporary and policy relevant evidence base on housing, homelessness and urban issues. So if you could please join me in welcoming Emma to the stage to begin her presentation.
Thank you very much. I just thought I would start off this talk with a kind of a statement that I call myself a housing researcher. And there's a few of us around Australia, hopefully some watching this evening. But what we do is work on understanding parts of the housing system, how we can make it better. In the last year, I say that because in the last year, I think as housing researchers, we've become incredibly popular. Housing researchers have always thought that what we do is important, but all of a sudden, lots of other people have thought, oh, actually housing's really quite important. And I suppose for our work, government's begun to think that housing's actually really important. So we've called tonight, Well May We Dwell, mainly because none of us can say it. But essentially what we're going to do is talk a bit about housing, what's happening, what's changed over the last year, and then we might muse on a housing future. That one, great. Then we might muse on what kind of a future we've got for housing in Australia. Over the next few slides, I'm just going to give you some context and data from a couple of large surveys that we've done. I'm also lucky enough to have Michael and Peter who will join me afterwards to reflect on it. So I suppose I'd love to set some homework for you for this. And can you hear me up the back? No. I'll yell a little bit. Can't hear. Come down. Okay, I'm going to yell as hard as I can. I'm going to give you a little bit of homework while I'm talking. I want you to think about yourself and how your view of housing might have changed over the last year. Do you think about your housing differently? Do you think about the housing system that we're in differently? Okay, so just to kind of kick off, I just wanted to, we kind of all know this, but it's almost exactly the 1 year anniversary of everything kicking off with coronavirus. So at the time, we didn't really know much about the virus, and strangely for now, to think there was actually no vaccine and probably no possibility of a vaccine. So what we had to do at the time was focus on slowing the transmission of COVID, and we did that essentially by preventing people from being exposed to it. What we did then was when lockdown happened, housing became the kind of the frontline defence. It became the place that we were able to isolate and the place that we were able to separate. And I think that's really important because instantly, almost overnight, it shone this really strong light on some failures in our housing system that we'd sort of tolerated, not quite got around to fixing, thought they were too difficult to fix. And if you think about those, maybe the one that jumps to mind first is homelessness. So on the 30th of March last year when we locked down, everyone went, what are we going to do about the homeless? So, there's been this massive natural experiment with the homeless population in Australia, and we might call on Michael to talk about that a little bit more. It also shone a light on maybe the relative insecurity of the rental market, you know, a form of insecurity that we'd probably tolerated. So if you think about it, the rental sector was designed in Australia around, you know, 1-year leases or 6-month or even 3-month leases. And all of a sudden, a lot of that came into focus as well. And of course, there are also problems with housing supply, especially at the more affordable end of the housing market. So as we kind of roll on to a 1-year anniversary of COVID, our houses have probably changed in the way that we look at them. You know, we've had to work at home. I built an office in my house imagining that I'd never have to work in it. It's a metre by a metre and it has no windows, but I've sat in there for the last year. You know, we've had to school our children at home. We've also thought about our houses in a different way because in the past we've all gone off to work or out for the day and we've never really had to heat them or cool them efficiently. So we've probably all got much bigger electricity bills than we've ever had before. So as housing researchers, we've been watching this all really closely because it's a big natural experiment for us. You know, we've been monitoring what's been happening in the rental sector, and I'll talk about that in a moment. That's important because I think the rental sector has become kind of that part of the housing market that's the most vulnerable to the COVID changes that we've seen in the workforce. We've been tracking the variation in the quality and condition of Australian houses and looking at what the health effects might be. And we've been looking at our changing preferences for housing and how they might be changing into the future. So I'll show you some of the things that we found tonight. There. How's the volume on that? Excellent. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the rental sector, and some people may ask why we're talking about the rental sector. It's actually Australia's fastest growing tenure. So you've got about a third of Australians are currently renters, and actually there's, as of about last year, we just flipped over in Australia for there being more renters than outright owners in the nation. So that statistic's actually really important because it's a big societal change. You know, renting was traditionally a stepping stone tenure where you kind of put up with poor conditions because you were eventually going to get into the housing market. You know, I know that I lived in student accommodation, which was actually appalling, but it's kind of a rite of passage and you kind of accept it. But now we've reached this point in Australia where probably most of our children could be renters for life. And most of our, you know, some of our peers will be renters for life. So, you know, rather than just kind of putting up with problems in the sector, we actually have to look at, you know, what the quality and conditions are. Anyway, in a happy coincidence, the Australian Research Council had just funded a massive data infrastructure project that we were leading. So we were about to go out into the field to collect 15,000 renters' rental experience, what was happening, and create a national data set. Luckily, Michael's organisation jumped in at the last minute and let us add on a COVID module. So we were primed to go into the field, and we've collected this massive data set on kind of what's been happening in the rental sector during COVID. I'll show you some of these findings. So the first thing to say is, when you look at the data set, you're absolutely struck by some really basic pre-existing quality issues. They're things like, you know, doors that don't lock properly, and damp and mould and drafts, plumbing, electrical issues. And the photos that I put up in the slide are actually from a citizen science project that we've done alongside of it, where we've asked renters in Australia to upload the photos of the insides of their houses. And if you're ever interested, the link's in the presentation and you can go in and have a look, see what kind of photos people have put up, or maybe put some up yourself as well. So 3 things I think shocked me about the data. First of all, cold and damp and mould each separately affect more than a quarter of rental households, and most people have more than one thing going on. They may have cold and damp, or they may have damp and mould. The other thing that strikes me, and it's tried to be represented in that middle graph, is that the worse your health, the more chance you have of living in a house that's cold, mouldy and damp, which means that what we're doing is actually putting our most vulnerable populations into the houses that are going to make them the most sick, effectively. And the third thing that struck me on that was the situation for children. So households with children are much more likely to live in housing that's rental housing that's poor condition. Okay. So I've just added this slide really to give you some kind of idea, hopefully you can read it, of just some of the qualitative findings of that. And I think that really kind of gives a much broader look of kind of what's actually happening. The thing to note about this is that these are responses collected in July 2020, so probably 14 weeks into the COVID lockdown, which means that already by July 2020, we've got large numbers of renters who had already moved back in with their parents, were already unable to buy food or heat their homes in winter. And I suppose topically, lots of people were really highly dependent on JobKeeper and JobSeeker. I'll just flick through some of these, but this I think gets to one of the core drivers of why COVID-19 affected the rental sector so much. Rental households, as we know, were really represented in the industries most affected by the lockdown measures, so things like the service sector and the hospitality industry. So therefore, the majority of renter households experience some kind of change to their income or employment. And that graph that I've just put up here gives you a bit of a look. Essentially, it's showing that young people are actually even more vulnerable. So almost 30% of young renters had their hours reduced, and the black arrows represent the rest of the other age populations. Okay, it almost doesn't matter which measure you do it on. Young people who are renting do worse than everyone else. I won't dwell on this slide, I'll come back to it later, but I think these two statistics probably worry me the most. They show us that, even really quite early on in the pandemic, Australian renters had already begun dipping into their savings, dipping into their superannuation. I'll come back to that point later, but I think you know where I'm going with it. This slide really just gives you an idea of the scale of the mental health effect for renters, and people with, for example, people with unaffordable housing costs had a 4 times greater chance of having a significant decrease in their mental health because of COVID. And I think we might talk about that later, but some of the explanation from that comes from things like the findings of the Victorian Commission that I was reading today that was talking about housing insecurity being one of the biggest drivers of mental health decline. Okay, so just to really briefly summarise what I think are kind of the major take-homes from the rental sector, I think, during COVID, we're struck in this group by the scale of the effect. Almost all tenants were affected in some kind of way, and often they're affected in multiple ways. So, things like a third of tenants struggled to make ends meet and skipped meals by July. The second is that, it's often the groups that we really should be looking out for who are doing the worst in COVID. Older people, families with young children, people with illnesses and disabilities. The other, and that I suppose relates to the next thing, is basic quality issues were existing in the stock, and they probably amplified a lot of the problems that we've been talking about today. Savings and superannuation, it's effectively people drawing on their savings and superannuation. We say it's kind of kicking the problem down the road, and I think that's going to be one of the big drivers of inequality in Australia when we get to 20 years' time and some people have already don't have any super because of that 1 year of COVID, effectively. And yeah, I think among the people in this very big collaboration of people doing this data, we were all kind of shocked by this kind of, or captured by this impression of, this population lined up on what we say the brink of a financial precipice, being protected really by a series of measures which have been really effective, like JobKeeper and JobSeeker and eviction moratoriums. And there's a real concern for what might happen, as these kind of protections are gradually pulled away. Anyway, I won't dwell on this, because I don't want to talk too long, but I just thought, seeing as a South Australian audience, I should probably give you some kind of an indication of how South Australia did. For our international audience, South Australia is almost the same as the rest of Australia in terms of its kind of demography and economy to all of the other parts of Australia, but it would be fair to say we're a little older, we're a little poorer, we don't tend to have as much high-rise development, a little bit less overseas migration. And we also strangely have the lowest vacancy rates in Australia at the moment for some bizarre reason, which we might get into after. Okay, so I think there's a lot to be concerned about in South Australia in that profile of renting, but we can maybe return to that in the question section after. Okay, this gets on to the exciting bit. So in these next few slides, I really want to just pull back from looking at one tenure to kind of look through the eyes of all of Australia into the future. So we've all heard anecdotes of, people's view of housing changing, what they want changing. I suppose we've all probably dreamed of having a beach house at the moment. Our home offices have all of a sudden become quite visible to the world. And I don't know how many people among you have thought about which books you're going to put behind you. But, there's a different way that we're using our houses. And one of the things that's really come out is this, small apartments in inner city areas, which may not be so relevant to Adelaide, but is definitely relevant to Melbourne and Sydney, are probably their most unpopular at the moment. So what we did was we commissioned a survey of the Australian people to give us an idea of the kinds of things that Australians were actually concerned about as we kind of head, hopefully, out of COVID or into a kind of an extended COVID period. So these results are really literally hot off the press. The first results came through late last week, and so we've just kind of put them into a view because we really wanted to show you. But I suppose if you've been thinking about what's become important to you in your housing, what you think's changed so far, you might be able to reflect in the next few slides on how you line up to the rest of Australia. So this is the first time we've shown these, but what this simple graph gives you a really clear idea of some of the things that have changed and what's important to Australians. What it does is it shows the proportion of Australians who said that COVID-19 had changed their view of these housing elements. It shows that we've all reflected on the presence or the absence of a backyard, or at least some private open space. So you'd interpret this by saying 75% of Australians have changed their mind about having a backyard or some private open space. People are also, and we'll get to this a little bit later as well, reconsidering what home ownership means. And I think this talks to some of the security of tenure that we were talking about in the first few slides. What I've put on so you can see, even having access to smarter home technologies and having an energy efficient home came out as important. And on the right, I put some of the qualitative responses, which give you more of an idea of, put some meat on the bones of those basic statistics. You can see, I don't know if they're the same kinds of things that you've been concerned about, but this next one is such an interesting group of findings. Here we asked people what they felt the most important housing issue that we needed to address as a nation was. And there are so many surprises in here for me. I was anticipating a completely different graph to this. For example, I'm quite surprised that only between 2 and 3% of the population are concerned with improving the housing condition for Aboriginal Australians, or even considering that so much of our work's been done in the private rental sector, that so few people are concerned with improving conditions in the private rental sector. I can understand the importance of housing affordability, which sits at about 30%, just over 30% of people. And I suppose I'm heartened about homelessness, because I really wasn't expecting that would be such a major issue, with almost 20% of people selecting that as the major issue that we needed to solve as a nation. Now, this next slide is really interesting. what we've done in this one is tried to capture how much people wanted these issues solved by government and by Australia. So we've asked them if it would influence their vote at the next election. Basically, the red end says, I select this as an important thing and yes, it would change my vote. And the black end says, no, it wouldn't change my vote. I think there's a lot to ponder here, but it leaves me with the feeling that housing is probably going to be quite a big issue as we kind of head into the next election. Okay, so just to roll up, before we have this open discussion, I just wanted to kind of plant 3 ideas into your minds about what I think the kind of priorities or how the priorities should be addressed. The first one is about data, and I know researchers always go on about data, but I think in Australia a lot of our assumptions about housing are often wrong and they're not actually based on data. So I'll talk about it later, but you know, Australia's always portrayed as a heat wave country where it's heat that's going to kill you, but it's actually cold, and Australian houses are you're much more likely to die from being in a cold house than a hot house in Australia, and Australia's worse than Sweden. So the other thing is that I think in terms of data, what we need, this is kind of a turning point moment for housing. Everything's about to change. What we want from our housing's changed. We're also doing this massive natural experiment with our housing. There's all of these things happening at the moment. So I think there's this need at the moment to jump on quickly and not get data organised for 5 years' time, but actually get on now and do those natural experiments. The second thing is, I think reflecting on this, we need to probably rethink the way that we do home ownership in Australia. You know, COVID has definitely made lots of us think about it and think about the relative insecurity of some forms of home ownership. But when you think about the fact that Australia is now flipped from being a home owning nation or a home owning and purchasing nation to a renting and purchasing nation, it's kind of at exactly this time that we probably need to think about, you know, home ownership and renting not in simple terms, but maybe in fuzzier terms. So, you know, the government owns the land and we own the house, or, you know, other forms of kind of more flexible forms of renting and owning, lifetime leases, things like that. And the final thing is, I think a healthy housing, hopefully we'll get to in the questions, I think maybe the entry point for talking about a lot of these housing issues is probably about health and minimum conditions. It's a really good way to start talking about it. I will probably leave it there because I have probably spoken for too long. Would you like me to bring... Oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Emma. Could you all join me in thanking Emma for her presentation? And I would like to invite Peter up to deliver a quick response to some of the data that Emma's presented there.
I did speak to too. Thanks. Amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. So first step is turn on the mic.
Oh.
There we go. Okay. So thank you, Emma. That was a fantastic presentation. So if we could have my slide up there about the price as a function of demand and supply. Beauty. Okay. So a lot of people have been asking, why have property prices gone up during a pandemic and even during a recession? So about a year ago, when we all found out that we were going to go into lockdown, I was a little bit worried because I'd never experienced anything like that before. So I thought, well, let's do some research to find out what's happened in previous recessions and the global financial crisis. So I did some research on what happened in the 1970s recession, 1980s, 1990s, and then the GFC. And interestingly, for the 2 years of the recession, now the recession did not go for 2 years, but during those 2 calendar years, and the 5 years after that, what we found was that property prices had increased 5 years after that recession. Now, in some cases, it was extraordinary. In the 1970s recession, Sydney property prices doubled 5 years after that recession. In the 1990s, it wasn't as good because we had in South Australia, the State Bank of South Australia collapsed. So on top of the recession, the national recession, we had a banking failure. In Victoria, the Pyramid Building Society, that impacted property prices as well. But let's fast track to today. So for those of you that have studied economics, you would know that the price of something is based on the demand for it, how many people want it, and the supply of it. So what we have here is on the left-hand side is an indicator of demand. That is finance, the number of people going to borrow money to buy a property. And you will see there's a light blue line and a dark blue line. The dark blue line is investors. So the number of investors borrowing money has diminished since 2016. One of the reasons is because it was around that time that investors had to come up with a bigger deposit. I don't know if you know, but the minimum deposit basically for a homeowner is 5%, but the minimum deposit for an investor is 10%. So it's harder for an investor to borrow the money because they need a big deposit. Also, investors pay a higher interest rate than owner-occupiers. So it was around that time that we saw less investors in the market replaced by owner-occupiers. So what we've seen from about 2015 to 2020, if we look at just the owner-occupiers, which are the dominant group, it was about $13 to $15 billion per year. But you look at how much that spiked, up to $21 billion. So in simple terms, demand for property has increased. Now, I could go on for ages to discuss why that demand has increased, but the end result is demand has increased. Now, if we look on the right-hand side, it's supply. In every capital city, except for Melbourne, there are less properties to buy. There are less properties on the market. So if we look at Adelaide, there are 35% less properties on the market to buy. So if we assume on the left-hand side that's an average for all the states, we've got about 50% more people who are ready to buy, but 35% less houses. So increased demand, decreased supply, prices only have one way to go up. Now that's property prices. Surprisingly, rents have also skyrocketed. And this is not so much a demand issue, but a supply issue. Because what's happening, as Emma said before, about a third of the population, about a third of housing is rented. So let's say out of 10 houses that are sold, 3 of them are rental properties. The other 7 were owned by owner-occupiers. They are all being sold to owner-occupiers. So now there are 3 less rental properties. If you multiply that by 1,000 or 10,000, there are a lot less rental properties. So it's not uncommon to see open inspections for rent, people lined up outside, applications as soon as they've seen the property, and people offering more than the advertised rent, which is exactly what's happening for properties for sale. You try and go to an open inspection, you have to line up outside. I mean, one reason is because of COVID-19 and social distancing, but the number of people that are going to open inspections, the number of people at auctions, and the prices that some properties are achieving is phenomenal. Like, I've been involved in property for a very long time, and I have never seen a frenzy like I'm seeing now. 2001, 2002, 2003 were great days for a lot of Australia so far as property prices were concerned. If you were an owner, property prices were going up. But I have never seen anything like this. And this is not just Adelaide-centric. It is happening all over the country. There are people paying exorbitant prices, mainly for lifestyle properties, properties on the beach. They're looking for that beach house, Emma. And the more expensive properties are just achieving some phenomenal prices. How long is this going to last? Well, a general upswing in property prices doesn't go longer than 3 years. So I can see property prices continuing to increase at whatever pace that might be for the next 2 to 3 years, because this started back in June, July. Once we worked out that the sky was not going to fall in, then we started to go out and buy property. How long this frenzy is going to last, I don't know, because I've never seen it before. I can't imagine it'll be with us until the end of the year, but it is just entertaining to go to an auction and see 60, 70 people, 10, 15 have registered, and prices going far above what you would think. It's not going to last forever. For those people who are looking to buy a house at the moment, it is very, very hard, but you just have to bide your time. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Raised some very interesting questions there, and I'm looking forward to getting into them with all of you. But before we get started, I'd like to welcome Michael to deliver his response as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess by way of introduction, I'm the Managing Director of AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. We are a national research institute that is solely dedicated to housing, homelessness and urban policy. We're funded by a joint agreement of the Australian government and all of the state and territory governments, and have been operating in this model since 1999, with a range of universities working as members of the institute delivering research, including Adelaide Uni, University of South Australia, and another 7 across the rest of the country at this stage, with others looking to join. Our purpose is to inform and influence housing and urban policy with good evidence that supports good policy outcomes for all Australians. Our chief mechanism for that, is it not working? Is that working? Yes? Yes, it's on. Our chief mechanism for that work is through an annual competitive funding round, a grant round of the National Housing Research Program, where we disperse around $3 million a year of research funds for competitive research at universities. All of our research is published on our website, is freely available for everyone. We recently published our 351st final report from a project. There's about 1,000 other reports of different types as well, so there's tons of material there. But really, I think the point today is around the work in COVID. And so what AHURI did 12 months ago was to pivot to the changing context, and instead of managing the normal funding round, which is an annual cycle, we did a priority brief for COVID to ask 3 simple questions. What will the housing impacts be of the COVID pandemic and the related restrictions? What will the impact be of the policy interventions that are being tested across the country? And how can housing policy help with national recovery? We very rapidly asked for proposals from academics. The work that Emma talked about is one of the successful projects in that round. We funded 8 projects across a range of those policy questions. And so far have published 9 of those reports prior to Christmas, with another one, a 10th one, coming out later this month. So it's been a really rapid and impactful piece of work. But it's not just one part of our COVID strategy. So really we did 3 things. We funded rapid research to address the national crisis. We changed our news and dissemination processes to focus on COVID with a COVID website hub that gathers information from all of the states and territories and the Commonwealth, and became a focal point for policymakers using that work to inform their own practice. And then we ran policy exchanges. So we ran a series of policy exchanges at local government level, at state and federal level, and internationally to swap ideas with other policymakers around the country and around the world. And we learned some really interesting things. The key responses to COVID in the housing space were essentially the same in Western economies across the globe. Really 4 things. Rough sleepers were moved into hotels, which were suddenly vacant. Moratoriums were in place for evictions for financial reasons and for rent increases in most jurisdictions. Banks or financial institutions were encouraged to provide mortgage holidays or mortgage relief, and income support was changed. So in Australia, job seeker, job keeper. And those are essentially the four common ingredients across the globe. In Australia, we had the Home Builder program, which was designed to continue to keep a pipeline of construction moving. That was quite successful. There were some similar programs in some other jurisdictions, but the 4 common things were common across the globe, frankly. And from all of the work we did over the last 12 months, I guess the key message that I would have from all of that is that the pandemic was not tenure neutral. In tax terms, we talk about tenure neutrality. So the tax system is not tenure neutral in that An owner-occupier has a different set of tax rules than an investor or a renter, and so on. So that sense that there is a differential impact to different tenure types. And certainly COVID has not been tenure neutral. Renters have been very hard hit by it. Rough sleepers have been actually reasonably well protected by it in terms of the move into hotel accommodations. That's not a long-term solution, but it's a really effective short-term solution. Those in social housing, and when I say social housing, that's the combination of public housing, which is state-owned and run, and community housing, which may be state-owned but run by not-for-profit organisations as lower-cost housing. People in those tenure forms were reasonably protected from the impact of COVID because their rents weren't increased, they were in reasonably secure tenure. And homeowners had obviously income impacts on them, particularly for investors who had to negotiate with their tenants about a potential deferral or reduction of their rent income. So those are the sort of the key lessons that we saw. Renters were most hard hit by it. We did work across all of the tenures, and there were some really interesting market dynamics. And I just want to combine comments made by Emma and Peter. Emma, you commented that Adelaide's vacancy rate in the rental market is the tightest across the country. A couple of weeks ago, the Deputy Premier of New South Wales got into some controversy for celebrating a vacancy rate of less than 0.5%, saying it was a champagne problem. It's not a champagne problem, it's a real problem. If you have no vacancies, if people can't find a place to rent, that's a problem. And in fact, each of the capital cities across the country is hurtling towards zero vacancy at the moment. And you combine that with the sort of very tight market where you've got lots of buyers trying to buy property, lots of renters trying to rent property, you've got a problem. You've got a real supply problem. And that's why prices are going up, essentially. That's the challenge before us all. That's probably enough from me for the moment. And I'll hand back.
No problem. Thank you very much, Michael. I'd just like to, please join me in thanking Michael for his response there. I would like to invite Emma and Peter back up to the stage, and I'm just going to flick to the next slide because we've got sort of a holding slide for this. Oh, we got it. There we go. Now we've had some pre-submitted questions from people who have registered, and I hope it's not too awkward if I'm over here, you guys are over there. I think we'll be fine. So I'm going to just go through the pre-submitted questions and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. The first one is for Michael. So you've addressed some of the programs that Australia has put in place and some of the things that have been done really well. Do you have any reflection on the sort of responses that have been made either locally or internationally that either haven't delivered the expected outcome or haven't worked as well as we would have liked? Or is it too early to say?
Well, for a lot of it, it's too early to say. But I mean, there are some things that clearly worked and some things that less so. Look, the National Cabinet as a crisis response was incredibly effective at cutting through really quickly, really rapid cooperation between Commonwealth and states, and that's not always the case. Intergovernment relations are always challenging, but really the cut through of that and the rapid coordination of policy was really successful. That was a bonus. You may be aware that COAC has formally been disbanded and replaced by the National Cabinet. What that looks like as a long-term solution is a whole other question. What worked well and what we should keep are not necessarily the same thing.
You turn the mic on.
It is on. Okay. Other things that worked well, I think, look, broadly, the coordination between states was the biggest win. So the states largely looked after renters with moratoria on evictions and rent increases. That was generally successful during the crisis. But what happens next is the real challenge. So I think for Adelaide on May 31st, the eviction moratoria gets lifted. I know in some states there's already discussion of a tsunami of homelessness where the evictions will spill forward after being held off. There's already been some confusion. I think one of the things that didn't work well is the individual negotiation of rent arrangements or rent changes between tenants and landlords. There's obviously a power dynamic there, but what wasn't found across the country was oversight of that process. So we've already seen lots of cases of confusion between landlords and tenants about whether rent's been reduced or deferred. Reduced is great for the tenant in that they don't have to pay as much. Deferred means they've got to pay it later. And those conversations are becoming very difficult and are playing out through SACAD and the equivalents across the country already. There'll be plenty more of that. So that's one of the things that I think could have been done better. One of the really strong advocacy messages that we heard throughout 2020 was we've taken rough sleepers and put them into hotels across the country. That was a pretty uniform response. And that proves that government could do it. But there aren't normally lots of vacant hotels available for that. And it's not a long-term solution in terms of the built form of hotels is not actually very suitable for addressing the complexities of homelessness. So as a long-term solution, that's not something we're going to be able to keep in its current form, but we need to transition intelligently from that into a longer-term solution. That's this year's challenge.
It would certainly be very challenging, I imagine. We'll move on to another question. This one's for Emma. You alluded in your talk that many Australians are living in housing that actually harms their health. Can you tell us a bit more about that and maybe hint at any potential solutions to that problem?
How about this? Is this working? Look, I don't think I even got to the statistic in my talk, but we do a lot of our work on the relationship between housing and health, and I suppose we've been talking about this for a long time in Australia as researchers, and it's been, I must admit, kind of a difficult topic to get picked up, but I'm incredibly hopeful. The statistics that we're looking at suggest that up to 2.5 million Australians are living in housing that's actually harming their health in some way. And what we mean by that is it might be housing that is of substandard conditions and quality, you know, with things like cracks and black mould, or it might be housing that's so unaffordable that they can't actually, you know, pay for medicines and you know, having a reasonable life, or, you know, it might be so unaffordable or insecure that their mental health is affected. So you've got all of these ways that housing affects health, and I suppose the thing to say is often someone who has one of these things that harms their health, they also have a whole bundle of other things that harm their health. So when we say 2.5 million Australians, I think, you know, there's a scale of people affected by their housing, and part of our job over the last few years has been to try and make the story. So, for example, on the cold housing we were talking about, you know, I think we haven't... a lot of our work has been in just trying to go out and measure it and make the story, so that then kind of the idea of healthy housing could become normal. So, you know, until we put sensors in people's houses in winter in Adelaide, no one really realised that, you know, none of the houses that we did one year ever got to the United Nations healthy housing temperature in the whole of the winter. You know, so a lot of this has been kind of just about making the story. The World Health Organisation's just released their healthy housing guidelines, so I think it's become a bit of a topic of interest around the world. And Australia is really just catching up to countries like New Zealand, where they've, you know, kind of worked an evidence base and built a series of legislations such as rental protections that seek to improve the kind of the healthiness of the housing stock. So I think we've got a long way to go, but I think, you know, talking about healthy housing is a really good thing. And of course, we've just had the Centre of Research Excellence in Healthy Housing funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. So I think, you know, finally, I think we've begun to make the story, and, you know, we'll kind of keep addressing it.
Thank you. All right, we've got another one here that maybe the entire panel can weigh in on. We'll see who jumps in first. Can you comment on, so there's clearly a lot of evidence being collected in a really, seems like a really nice methodical way at the moment. How is that evidence then being taken up by the state and territory governments? What's that reception like, and how are we, specifically to make our living environments healthier?
We'll all have a go at that.
Yeah, I think we'll all have a go, but I might go first if I may. One of the things that I mentioned in my initial comments, I guess, was the policy exchanges we did. So in particular with the COVID funding round, where we had 8 projects across the country, looking at marginal housing, renters, rebuilding the economy and so on. Those projects were incredibly condensed, and so they commenced in May and were completed by October for work that would typically be done over a 12 to 18 month period. So the researchers across the country really lifted and produced very rapid work, as did our peer reviewers, editors, and the whole publishing process. But even before we published that work in October through to December, we held policy exchanges with senior officials from each state and territory and the Commonwealth to talk about the findings as they were being analysed, and to in fact get their input into the analysis so that the work that was produced would be as relevant as possible. So even well before publication, we were actually working directly with policymakers to use that work. That's something that there's an appetite for continuing. It gets tricky with publication schedules and so on, but there is a need to have that continuing dialogue. The other quick point I'll make is that the work we did was largely focused on the early period of the pandemic, of the time when Melbourne was in complete shutdown for months. We need to do work that looks beyond that into the recovery period.
Just to be a little bit positive, I think there's some really incredible work being done in terms of minimum standards in Australia. So, you know, Victoria's probably leading the way, but all of the states are kind of lined up behind them, ready to run with minimum standards. And I actually think minimum standards is something that benefits all of us, because if we can agree on minimum standards, it means we're not having these conversations about bringing up the people who are really doing badly. It just means we all agree on a minimum standard and everyone gets it, which is, I think, is good. The other thing is, I suppose, we shouldn't assume that the building code will do the job, because, you know, I think in the past a lot of people have thought, well, the building code's there, so everything's going to be fine. I mean, apart from the fact that we only add 2% of new dwellings every year, so it would take us about 50 years to have good housing from today if we change the building code to make it, you know, it healthy. One of the New Zealand researchers described our building code as a kind of a list of the worst thing that you're allowed to build as well. So it's not aiming for healthy or really good, it's just saying this is the point at which you can't go below.
So my learned colleagues here do a lot more research on housing than I do, but firstly, kudos to the Victorian Government for the minimum standards and also their investment in social housing, which is fantastic. What I'd like to point out is, like, a lot of research and a lot of data went into a lot of the initiatives, home builder, JobKeeper, job seeker, and this was not foreseen, but there have been some unintended consequences. So I don't know if you realise, but there is a national shortage of timber, concrete and reinforcing steel because of the stimulus that was brought about by home builder. So in some cases, that's actually brought on unemployment, because if the timber's not there, the roofers can't do their job, the cabinet maker can't do their job, and so on and so on. So firstly, some great initiatives, working well with researchers, data collectors, but who would know? Because I'd never seen this. I mean, I've heard of, you know, tradies asking a fortune for their labour, but to have a shortage of supply of materials, I have never encountered that before. But it just goes to show how inelastic the supply of housing is. Like when the Prime Minister announced home builder, demand from first home buyers increased overnight. But that didn't mean that we had all these extra houses overnight, because it takes time to find the land, put in the infrastructure and build the houses. And when you have a supply shortage, it just means that those houses are going to take even longer to be built. Thanks, Carly.
Next one. All right, well, I think we actually might be time to open up the floor to some audience questions. We have a roving mic somewhere. So does anyone have any questions that they might like to ask? If so, pop your hand up. Here we go. We've got one in the middle here.
Shout. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the lovely talk about the private housing market. How is the non-private housing market doing? You know, the Housing Trust, Anglicare, ECH, how is that fulfilling a niche?
It's a fantastic question.
Can I start on that? Because, you know, one of the really interesting things that we've discovered, you know, our rental survey looked at private and social rental, and the absolute value of the social rental sector in protecting people came out during COVID. So, you know, the thing that made rental difficult for renters was, you know, a lot of it was about the insecurity of tenure, and it was about the having to negotiate with landlords and agents and not really knowing, you know, not really having a process for doing that negotiation. Well, social housing tenants actually did quite well because they had security of tenure, they didn't have to negotiate over rent changes. The income in many cases went up because of JobKeeper and JobSeeker. So yeah, our data shows that social housing tenants have actually done quite well during COVID. I don't know if either of you want to add.
Yeah, I would just add to that the problem we have across this country is a lack of social housing. We have a really low supply of social housing. So Emma mentioned that private rental is the growth tenure. It's approaching 40% of households. In South Australia, historically, the public housing and community housing sector have represented around 6% of all dwellings. That's drifting towards 4%. Could be worse in Victoria, it's more like 2.5%, but we do have the big social housing build going on in Victoria over the next 4 years. That's the sort of investment that we need to see across the country year on year for the next 20 to catch up with the sort of supply we actually need in that space to be equivalent to other OECD nations.
Have you got an explanation why it's going downwards rather than upwards?
Well, yeah, there's less being built than is going into decline.
Why?
That's that is a question for the minister.
I'd just like to add my favourite statistic that I found in an old textbook. So South Australia's stock of public housing peaked in 1966 at 18% of the housing stock. So when Michael's talking about falling down to 4%, you can see, you know, how much South Australia's changed. You know, in South Australia, public housing was a way for the government to build houses and sell houses, you know, to sitting tenants and other people. But yeah, it was a major part of our housing stock before.
Thank you very much. Any other comments on that one?
One more point if I can.
Of course, absolutely.
Just one
Go
really
ahead.
quick point. I guess the final point on that is in the fast-growing centres, Melbourne, Sydney, Southeast Queensland, part of the problem is there's just so much private development that the ratio that is social housing can't keep up with that. Adelaide's slower population growth means that it should be possible, but it becomes a political decision whether or not that's a priority. And clearly over the last 20 years or so across the country, it hasn't been sufficiently. There's been really strong campaigning over the last couple of years to the Commonwealth Government to invest in social housing in the way that the Commonwealth did in 2007-8 for the Social Housing Initiative, which was about a $5.5 billion investment in more stock, but that has yet to happen this time around.
Thank you. I might just quickly jump in with one from our online viewer, and this is something that I was wondering about as well, actually. Craig asks, is there something going on with, he says, going on here, I assume meaning with your studies that are being conducted, with sampling bias or social desirability bias in relation to your data on, for example, the most important COVID housing issues? Can you comment on that's the sort of methodology behind the data collection there?
Look, in these ones, they're massive panels. So so we've looked at them, and they're representative and random in terms of the Australian population across states and between genders and across age groups. So, you know, we'll be looking at, I mean, really that data literally arrived at the end of last week, but we'll be looking in more detail. But, you know, I think it's picking up a good picture of the Australian people.
Absolutely. Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We have one down the front here.
What can be done to reduce rent increases?
So what can be done to reduce rent increases? So one option is obviously to increase supply of rental property. And we've had initiatives in the past like the National Rental Affordability Scheme, NRAS, which was implemented as an initiative to help us get over the global financial crisis. So that encouraged private investors and developers to get into the market to increase supply. Social housing, increased social housing. Or we might have to look at alternative ways of living, group dwellings, co-living. Co-living is a big movement overseas where you might have a number of people living in the one dwelling. They share communal facilities, have their own bedrooms, maybe their own private living area, but certainly co-living, and my students are doing a lot of research on co-living around the world, a very big growth area. But at the moment in Australia, our mindset, our culture is like we are almost obsessed with owning our own home, and our own home means we're just the only ones living in that particular dwelling. Rent increases. All right, sorry, rent increases. I went off track there, sorry. So again, it's demand and supply. So if you want to decrease rents, we have to increase supply, or you decrease demand by encouraging renters who can and who want to go buy property through incentives like the government has offered, through grants from state government, and a very not very well-known fact is the state government at the moment has a $10,000 interest-free loan, not grant, but interest-free loan to those people who want to buy, generally get out of the rental market. Demand and supply, just like that graph I showed you.
I mean, absolutely, it is demand and supply. When there are vacancy rates as low as they currently are, rents will go up, not down. That's the economics of it. I guess the other point to make is that subsidised housing, more affordable housing, requires subsidy. Now, whether that's by a government at state or federal level, or by a homeowner at an individual level, and we are increasingly seeing individual mum and dad investors making the rent more affordable to their tenants, either working with a not-for-profit real estate enterprise that is focused on that, or just individually doing that. There's a pattern that's growing because people are aware of the challenges. But a systemic solution, subsidy is what's required. Supply and subsidy, they're the two.
We have another question just down the front here.
Yeah, I think she's been asking about rent control, legislated rent control that has been done in the past in a lot of places. I think that's what she's been asking. People never asked to answer her question.
Okay, thank you to the panel for that's an important question. Sounds like it'll be part of the discussion continuing. If you would like to make a comment, of course.
Thank you for that clarification. I think in terms of rent control, there isn't really a history of rent control legislation in this country in the way we've seen in places like New York, where it's been a really impactful measure on the market. It simply hasn't been part of the tapestry here. There is a potential for it, yes.
Thank you. Any additional questions from the audience? Oh, one up in the middle there.
Thank you. I'm Nancy. I'm from the Netherlands, so I have a bit of a different perspective on what's happening in the housing market. One thing I haven't heard mentioned yet is the issue or the matter of negative gearing. I believe that's a major thing here, and if that could change, that might open up the way of improving social or affordable housing. So I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Okay, so not only am I a lecturer here, but I'm also the chairperson of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, so accountants, mortgage brokers, lawyers, so on. So negative gearing is not very politically popular. I certainly understand the principles behind it, but the Labor government has tried to change negative gearing rules twice, lost twice. I doubt very much they'll bring it in the third time, but I understand the principle because negative gearing encourages investors to buy property which may have been bought by somebody else to live in as a home rather than as a rental property. But politically, it's just suicide if you're going to try and change negative gearing. In the Netherlands, I'd be interested to know, in the Netherlands, are there any tax benefits from your own home? Like, do you pay capital gains tax when you sell your own home?
Well, it's really funny because I never owned a home in Holland because
Okay.
I've rented for over 20 years, so I wouldn't know from my personal experience. I think what you were saying, I think because of the negative gearing, I think you keep the market closed for people that actually need affordable housing. So I think you're sort of, but I think we probably all know that. Not everybody is benefiting equally. So how do you believe that, because now you see that housing is got more on the agenda again, is there sort of like maybe initiative to get some data collection on, trying to sort of support the data in actually trying to change the system, and not, because if there's more people that can benefit, and if it's like related to the health issue, and you can prove that people are getting healthier, and because I'm not convinced on the other side that people owning their place always have the best quality of housing as well, but that's just, again, with my different framework of looking at how things are built here. So do you think there would be an opportunity to collect more data to sort of support the politicians to try, for the third time, and then have everybody be happy about that?
We all want to talk about this. I think, my personal view is that housing policy is an irrational process, and sometimes policy isn't made on the basis of data, even though I'd like for it to be. I suspect that there would be no data we could ever pull up that would win the eliminate negative gearing debate, but Michael might have some.
Yeah, it's an enduring topic, and it's an important topic, and broadly support your comments. One of the things that Ahuri did a few years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago now, was to invest in a program of research that didn't so much tackle the question, should we have negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, but how do we reform those concessions in the political landscape? So how do we actually navigate the politics of the issue? And it was a really interesting piece of work, and I guess what I would say in terms of, Peter, your comment that Labor has taken this to the last 2 elections, they didn't read our report. They didn't follow the map that we provided. Neither side of politics did. Look, it's remained in place. It probably should go. It's not as big an issue as people have made it out to be, but it is something that could be addressed.
And I think, just to go on from that, Michael, it's not the politicians you have to convince, it's the people that vote for the politicians that you have to convince. And that's a much bigger task. Yeah.
And I suppose maybe we go about it a different way. And I like that story about you renting, most of your life. I think the challenge for us in Australia is, how do we actually make renting a viable tenure that people want to live in for the rest of their lives, where they don't have to go from year to year leases, where you can put pictures on the wall and carpet on the floor and have some rent control. So, I think there's probably other ways that we can work on it too.
Thank you all for your comments on that. We unfortunately have come very close to the end of our allotted time. So I would like to finish up now by thanking our panel of speakers, Professor Emma Baker, Dr. Michael Fotheringham, and Peter Cazilos. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers. And I would also like to say thank you to you, our audience, for coming along tonight, and thank you very much to the people who've joined us online. Thank you for your questions and your comments. It has been, I've learnt a lot. It's been fantastic, so thank you all. This has been our second Research Tuesdays for 2021, and on behalf of the Research Tuesdays team and the University of Adelaide, I want to thank you all for your time tonight. We are very excited to be back here delivering these events in person, and also for you to view at home. We look forward to inviting you back in April to hear from me. I'm going to be speaking about my PhD research into diabetes and diabetic vascular complications. So if you are interested in that, please be sure to sign up to our mailing list so you can receive the latest information about that and all the other Research Tuesdays information that we've got available. So thank you again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time. Good night, everyone.